Most people think the UK housing crisis is slowing down, that it peaked last year, that the worst has already passed, that if they just hang on a bit longer, things will calm down. That idea is wrong, completely wrong. In fact, in some UK cities, the damage is already done. Not in the future. Not in 5 years. Right now. There are places in this country where working full-time no longer covers rent, where families are packing up and leaving not because they want to, but because they have no choice. Where councils are cutting services so deep that basic things people relied on for years are just gone. And here's the part that should worry you the most. This isn't happening in 1 or 2 places. It's not just London. It's not just the usual names you hear on the news. It's spreading, quietly, fast. And if you live in the UK, there is a very real chance that your city is either already on this list or will be soon. Because what unlivable means has changed. It doesn't mean war zones or total collapse. It means something much more subtle and much more dangerous. It means doing everything right and still falling behind. It means working more hours but having less left at the end of the month. It means your rent going up again while your pay stays the same. It means living in a place that used to feel normal, safe, and stable, and slowly realizing it no longer is. For a long time, people were told this was just the cost of living going up, or bad luck, or temporary pressure. But what if it's not temporary? What if this is the new normal for large parts of the UK? Because when you look closely at what's happening, not just prices but services, housing quality, overcrowding, and how fast people are being pushed out, a very uncomfortable picture starts to form. Some UK cities are crossing a line. A line where living there no longer makes sense unless you're already wealthy, already locked into housing, or willing to accept a lower quality of life year after year. And once a city crosses that line, it's incredibly hard to come back. Here's what most people don't realize. Cities don't suddenly collapse. They don't wake up one morning and stop working. They decline slowly, piece by piece. Rent rises first, then key workers leave. Then services shrink. Then families move away. Then only certain groups can afford to stay. By the time it's obvious, it's too late. And that process is now happening across the UK, faster than it ever has before. You might already feel it. Maybe your rent jumped by hundreds in 1 year. Maybe viewings feel like competitions now. Maybe your commute got longer because you had to move further out. Maybe your city feels more crowded, more tense, more stretched. These are not random changes. They are warning signs. And what makes this moment different from the past is speed. In previous decades, decline took years, sometimes decades. People had time to adjust. This time, entire cities are tipping in just a few years. And that raises a question nobody in power seems willing to answer honestly. If working people can't afford to live in major UK cities, who are those cities actually for? Because cities don't run on investors. They don't run on empty flats. They run on teachers, nurses, builders, shop workers, drivers, carers. When those people leave, cities don't just get expensive. They stop functioning. And we are already seeing that happen. Hospitals struggling to staff roles, schools short on teachers, councils cutting services they once said were essential, entire neighborhoods changing almost overnight. This isn't just a housing problem anymore. It's a social problem, an economic problem, and whether politicians like it or not, a political problem. And yet, every time this comes up, the conversation gets pushed aside. People are told to move somewhere cheaper, as if cheaper places are endless, as if jobs, family, and support systems don't matter. But what happens when there are no cheaper options left? What happens when the pressure spreads from the biggest cities into smaller ones, and then into towns that were once seen as safe bets? That's exactly what's happening now. And in this video, we're going to break it down properly. Not with headlines, not with panic, but with clear, simple explanations. We're going to look at 10 UK cities where living is becoming harder, faster, and more fragile than most people realize. Some of them will not surprise you. Others absolutely will. And as we go through them, a pattern will emerge. A pattern that explains why this crisis keeps getting worse and why ignoring it only speeds things up. This isn't about blaming people for wanting a better life. It's about understanding what's breaking and why. Because once you see how these cities reach this point, you start to understand something much bigger about the future of the UK. A future where the question won't be, can I afford to buy a home, but can I afford to stay here at all? And that question is already being answered, quietly, by thousands of people every single month. Let's talk about how we got here and which cities are being hit first. When people hear the word unlivable, they often imagine something extreme: blackouts, empty shops, chaos in the streets. That's not what we're talking about here. What's happening in many UK cities is quieter than that. And because it's quieter, it's easier to ignore until it affects you directly. An unlivable city doesn't mean everything stops working. It means the basics stop lining up. It means the numbers don't add up anymore, even if you do everything right. You can have a job, you can show up every day, you can try to save, and still feel like you're slipping backwards. That's the reality many people are living with now. And the reason this matters is because it's not just happening to a small group of people on the edges of society. It's hitting people in the middle, people who used to feel stable, people who never thought they'd be thinking about leaving their city, their job, or even the country. This video isn't about fear for the sake of fear. It's about clarity. Because right now, the public conversation around housing and cost of living is completely broken. You'll hear that prices are cooling, or that inflation is coming down, or that things will balance out over time. But when you step back and look at how people are actually living, those phrases stop meaning much. If rents are still rising faster than wages, cooling doesn't help. If services are shrinking, balance doesn't help. If younger people can't put down roots, time doesn't help. So instead of talking in vague terms, this video looks at real places and real trends. We're going to look at 10 UK cities where the pressure has built up so much that living there is becoming harder to justify with every passing year. This isn't a ranking, it's not a competition, and it's not about pointing fingers at residents. It's about understanding which cities are being hit first and why. Because once you understand that, you start to see where the rest of the country could be heading. As we go through these cities, we're not just looking at house prices or rent listings in isolation. We're looking at the full picture. Can people actually afford to live there on normal wages? Are essential workers staying or leaving? Are councils coping or cutting back? Is quality of life improving or quietly getting worse? These questions matter far more than headline numbers. A city can look fine on paper and still be failing the people who live there. And this isn't something that happened overnight. Many of these places were once seen as success stories. Cities people moved to for work, for opportunity, for a better life. Some were affordable alternatives to bigger cities. Others were regional hubs that kept local economies alive. But over time, something changed. Housing supply didn't keep up. Demand kept rising. Wages stalled. Costs climbed. And slowly, the balance tipped. One of the biggest mistakes people make when thinking about this crisis is assuming it affects everyone equally. It doesn't. If you bought a home years ago, you're shielded. If you have family support, you're protected. If you're on a high income, you can absorb the costs. But if you're renting, starting out, or trying to build a future from scratch, the pressure is constant. And that pressure shapes decisions in ways that don't show up in statistics. People delay having kids. People stay in bad housing. People commute longer and longer hours. People leave places they love because they can't make the maths work. Over time, that changes what a city is. Because when the people who keep things running are forced out, the character of a place changes. Services suffer, communities weaken, and the sense of stability disappears. That's when a city starts to feel unlivable, even if the streets are still busy and the buildings are still standing. Another reason this conversation matters now is because the pace has picked up. 10 years ago, these changes happened slowly. You had time to adjust. You could plan around them. Now, entire neighborhoods can become unaffordable in a couple of years. Rents can jump by hundreds in a single renewal. Waiting lists for housing and services can explode almost overnight. And once that happens, there's no easy reset. What makes this even more serious is that many of the systems meant to catch people when things get hard are also under strain. Councils are stretched, healthcare is overwhelmed, public transport is under pressure, so when people fall through the cracks, there's often nowhere to land. This is why the idea that people should simply move somewhere cheaper doesn't hold up. Cheaper places are becoming harder to find, and when large numbers of people move at once, those places quickly become expensive too. We've already seen this pattern play out. Pressure starts in major cities, then it spills into surrounding towns, then into regions that once felt untouched. By the time the conversation catches up, the damage is already widespread. This video is about spotting those patterns early, not to scare people, but to give them the information that's often missing from public debate. Because once you understand what makes a city tip from hard to unlivable, you start to see the warning signs everywhere. You might even recognize them where you live. As we move through this video, we'll break down each city clearly and calmly. No exaggeration, no hype, just what's happening, why it's happening, and who it's affecting most. By the end, you'll have a much clearer picture of where the UK is heading and why this issue is about much more than housing. It's about whether ordinary life in British cities is still sustainable. And that's the question we need to start asking before even more places cross a line they can't come back from. To really understand why some UK cities are becoming unlivable, you first have to understand what the core problem actually is. And it's not just one thing. It's not just rent. It's not just house prices. It's not just inflation or interest rates. It's the way all of these pressures are stacking on top of each other at the same time and landing on the same people. For a long time, housing problems were treated like a side issue, something frustrating but manageable, something people would figure out eventually. That's no longer true. Housing has become the center of everything. It decides where you live, how long you commute, whether you can save, whether you can start a family, and even whether you stay in the country. When housing breaks, life around it breaks too. The first and most obvious part of the problem is affordability. And not affordability in the abstract, but in everyday terms. How much of your income disappears just to keep a roof over your head? In many UK cities, rent is no longer a large expense. It's the main expense. For some people, it's half their income. For others, even more. That leaves very little room for anything else. Food, transport, energy, council tax, all of it has to be squeezed into what's left. And when something unexpected happens, like a car repair or a bill spike, there's no buffer. Just stress. What makes this worse is that wages haven't kept up. Not even close. People are often told that the problem is their job, or their choices, or their expectations. But when you look at the numbers, that argument falls apart. Many people working full-time in essential roles simply do not earn enough to live comfortably in the cities they serve. That's a huge shift from the past. There was a time when working full-time meant stability. You might not have been rich, but you could pay your rent, cover your bills, and slowly build a life. That promise has quietly disappeared in many places. The second part of the problem is supply, or more accurately, the lack of it. For years, the UK has not built enough homes to match demand. This isn't new. It's been warned about repeatedly. But warnings don't create houses. When there aren't enough homes, competition increases. When competition increases, prices rise. And when prices rise, those with less power lose out. That usually means renters first. Landlords can choose who they rent to. They can raise prices. They can sell. Renters don't have the same flexibility. And when demand is high enough, quality stops mattering. People accept smaller spaces, poor insulation, damp, long commutes, short contracts, because the alternative is worse. This creates a situation where cities look busy and successful from the outside, but daily life inside them becomes harder and harder. The third part of the problem is pressure on services. As cities grow more crowded and more expensive, services don't magically expand to match. In many cases, they shrink. Councils are expected to do more with less. Healthcare systems are stretched. Public transport struggles to keep up. So while more people are packed into the same space, the support around them weakens. This is where unlivable really starts to take shape, because even if you can just about afford the rent, you're now dealing with longer waits, worse infrastructure, and fewer safety nets. And that pressure isn't evenly spread. Certain neighborhoods feel it first, then entire cities. The fourth part of the problem is instability. When people don't know if they'll be able to afford their rent next year, or whether they'll be forced to move, it changes how they live. They don't invest in their community. They don't plan long-term. They don't feel settled. That sense of constant uncertainty wears people down. Cities need stability to function well. Stable residents, stable workforces, stable communities. When turnover becomes constant, things start to fray. Schools struggle with changing populations. Local businesses lose regular customers. Social ties weaken. All of this makes a place feel less livable, even if nothing dramatic happens. Another key part of the problem is who gets pushed out. It's not random. The people who leave first are often younger, lower paid, or in essential roles. The very people cities rely on to function day to day. When those people leave, the effects ripple outward. Hospitals struggle to staff wards. Care homes struggle to hire carers. Construction slows because workers can't afford to live nearby. These are not future risks. They're current realities in many places. And once this cycle starts, it feeds itself. As workers leave, services weaken. As services weaken, quality of life drops. As quality of life drops, more people leave. Breaking that cycle is extremely difficult. Another uncomfortable truth is that the housing system rewards scarcity. High prices benefit some people. Rising rents benefit others. And because of that, there is very little urgency to fix the underlying issues. When housing becomes an investment first and a place to live second, decisions change. Policies focus on protecting prices, not people. Short-term fixes replace long-term planning. Delay becomes the default response. Meanwhile, the pressure keeps building. What makes this especially dangerous is that the problem doesn't feel dramatic until it's advanced. Cities don't collapse with a bang. They hollow out slowly. People adjust their expectations downward. They accept less space, less time, less comfort. And because everyone is doing it, it feels normal. Until one day it doesn't. Until people start asking why they're working so hard for so little return. That's when trust starts to break. Trust in institutions, trust in leadership, trust that the system is fair. And once trust erodes, fixing the physical problem becomes even harder. This is why the idea that this crisis is just about housing misses the point. Housing is the pressure point, but the damage spreads everywhere else. It shapes how cities grow, who stays, and who leaves. It decides whether a place feels like a home or just somewhere you survive. And right now, in multiple UK cities, that balance is tipping the wrong way. Not because people are lazy, not because expectations are too high, but because the basic equation no longer works. Income minus housing costs minus living costs leaves nothing left. No margin, no security, no sense of progress. And when that becomes normal, cities stop being places where people build lives. They become places people pass through or escape from. That's the core problem at the heart of this video. And once you understand that, the stories of each city start to make sense. Because while every place is different, they are all being pulled by the same forces. For some, the breaking point has already passed. For others, it's approaching fast. And the question now isn't whether more cities will be affected. It's how many, and how soon. To understand why so many UK cities have reached this point, you have to go back. Not just a few years, but decades. This didn't happen because of one bad year or one bad decision. It happened because of a long chain of choices that slowly pushed housing away from being a basic need and toward being something else entirely. After the Second World War, Britain treated housing as essential infrastructure. Homes were built at scale. Councils played a major role. The goal wasn't profit, it was stability. For a while that worked. People could move to cities for work and expect to find somewhere to live. Housing wasn't cheap, but it was achievable. Rents and wages had some kind of relationship with each other. That started to change in the late 20th century. One major shift was the move away from large-scale public housing. Over time, councils built fewer homes. Existing stock was sold off. Replacement slowed down. This wasn't framed as a problem at the time. Homeownership was promoted as a success, but the long-term effect was simple. Fewer homes under public control and more pressure on the private market. When demand rose, there was no buffer. At the same time, planning rules became tighter and slower. Building homes turned into a long, expensive process. Local opposition grew. Developments were delayed or reduced. So while the population grew, housing supply did not keep up. That gap is at the heart of today's crisis. Another big change was how housing was treated financially. Over the years, property became a store of wealth, a way to build security, a way to invest. That changed behavior at every level. Buy-to-let expanded, speculation increased, prices were expected to rise, not just keep pace. When housing becomes something people expect to make money from, scarcity stops being a problem to fix and starts being something to protect. This shaped policy in quiet ways. Decisions were made to avoid price falls, supply increases were slowed or softened, short-term political risk was avoided. At the same time, wages stopped growing like they used to. Productivity gains slowed, secure jobs became less common. Many people moved into work that paid less or offered fewer protections. So you had a system where housing costs kept rising, but incomes did not. That imbalance grew year after year. Another key factor was population pressure. The UK added millions of people over a relatively short period of time. Regardless of where people stand politically on this, the reality is simple. More people need more homes. But the housing system was never adjusted to handle that scale of growth. Instead of building enough homes to match demand, the pressure was absorbed through higher prices and rents. Cities felt this first. Urban areas attract jobs, education, and opportunity. When housing supply can't respond, prices spike. This is why cities are always hit hardest. Political decisions also played a role in weakening local government. Councils were given more responsibilities but fewer resources. Funding models changed. Costs rose. Housing benefit, temporary accommodation, and social care began to consume larger shares of local budgets. This left councils trapped. They couldn't build enough homes. They couldn't maintain services. They couldn't absorb rising demand, so they cut where they could. Libraries closed, maintenance was delayed, community services were reduced. These cuts didn't make headlines, but they changed daily life. Another important moment came after the 2008 financial crisis. Instead of rethinking the housing system, the focus was on restarting price growth. Low interest rates made borrowing cheap. This pushed prices higher again, especially in cities. For people who already owned property, this felt like recovery. For those who didn't, it pushed ownership further out of reach. At the same time, renting expanded rapidly. More people rented for longer. But the rental system was never designed for that scale. Short-term contracts, weak protections, and limited supply created insecurity. People moved more often. Rents rose faster. Stability declined. Then came a series of shocks. Brexit uncertainty slowed construction. The pandemic disrupted building and supply chains. Inflation pushed costs higher across the board. Interest rate rises hit both renters and homeowners. Each shock on its own was manageable. Together, they pushed an already fragile system closer to the edge. What makes the current moment different is that there is no slack left. In the past, people could move down the housing ladder. They could move out of cities. They could rely on family or local support. Those options are shrinking. Smaller cities and towns are now under pressure too. Family homes are being subdivided. Temporary fixes are becoming permanent. This is why the crisis now feels everywhere at once. Another uncomfortable truth is that fixing this problem is politically hard. Building more homes creates opposition. Changing tax rules upsets powerful groups. Allowing prices to fall scares voters. So the easiest option is delay. But delay has a cost. Every year the system stays broken. More people are pushed out. More cities cross the line from difficult to unlivable. And once that happens, reversing the damage becomes much harder. This is the context behind what you're seeing today. It's not a mystery. It's not bad luck. It's the result of long-term choices meeting short-term shocks. Understanding that doesn't make the situation less serious, but it does make one thing clear. Without real change, the pressure on UK cities will continue to grow. And the cities that are struggling now are only the beginning. Now that we've laid out why this is happening, it's time to look at where it's happening. These are 10 UK cities where the pressures we've talked about are no longer abstract. They're shaping daily life in ways that are hard to ignore. This isn't about saying these places are doomed. Many of them are still full of life, culture, and opportunity. But the balance that makes a city livable is shifting fast. We'll start with the places most people expect, and then move to the ones that might surprise you. City 1, London. London has always been expensive. That's not new. What's new is who can still afford to live there. For years, London worked because high costs were matched by high opportunity. You paid more, but you earned more. That equation is breaking. Rents have surged far beyond wage growth. Even people on solid salaries are spending huge chunks of their income just to stay put. Many are downsizing, sharing longer than planned, or moving further out. At the same time, services are under strain. Transport costs are high, commutes are longer. Key workers are leaving because they can't make it work. London isn't unlivable for everyone. But for a growing number of people, it no longer makes sense. And when a city starts losing the people who keep it running, the effects spread quickly. City 2. Birmingham. Birmingham was once seen as a more affordable alternative to London. A growing economy, strong universities, and major investment projects made it attractive. But that affordability gap has closed fast. Rents have jumped. Competition for housing has intensified. Wages haven't kept up. Many people who moved to Birmingham to escape London prices are now finding the same pressures, just on lower pay. Public services are stretched, and council finances are under serious strain. What's worrying about Birmingham is the speed of change. It didn't have decades to adjust. Pressure arrived quickly, and the system is struggling to absorb it. City 3. Manchester. Manchester's rise over the last decade has been dramatic. Jobs, culture, and development brought people in from across the UK, but success has come with a cost. Housing supply hasn't matched demand. Rents in central areas have soared. New developments are often aimed at higher earners or investors. For people who grew up in Manchester, staying has become harder. For newcomers, expectations are colliding with reality. Manchester still feels vibrant, but underneath that energy is growing strain. When a city grows faster than its foundations, cracks appear. City 4. Bristol. Bristol is a city people love. Strong job market, good quality of life, and a distinct identity. That popularity has pushed it into dangerous territory. Bristol now has some of the highest rents outside London. Wages have not followed at the same pace. Many renters are spending extreme proportions of their income just to stay. Finding housing is competitive and stressful. Families are being priced out. Bristol shows how a nice city can become unlivable, not because it fails, but because it succeeds too well without enough homes. City 5. Brighton. Brighton has long been desirable. Coastal living, strong culture, easy access to London. That demand has turned into pressure. Housing is scarce. Prices are high. Many homes are small, old, or poorly insulated. Seasonal demand and short-term lets add to instability. For younger people and lower-paid workers, Brighton has become a place you pass through, not settle in. It's a clear example of how lifestyle cities can hollow out when housing is treated as a premium product instead of a basic need. Now let's move to the cities fewer people talk about, the ones that feel like they should still be safe. City 6. Nottingham. Nottingham was once known for affordability. Students, young workers, and families could make it work. That's changing. Rents are rising fast. Competition has increased. Local wages remain modest. What makes Nottingham worrying is that people don't expect this level of pressure. Support systems aren't built for it. When cities like Nottingham start to struggle, it shows the crisis has moved beyond the obvious hotspots. City 7. Leeds. Leeds has grown steadily. Strong jobs, expanding population, and regional importance. But housing supply has lagged. Rents are climbing. Commutes are longer. Services are under pressure. Leeds illustrates how regional hubs are being pulled into the same patterns as larger cities, without the same pay levels to offset costs. It's becoming harder to build a stable life, even for people doing everything right. City 8. Oxford is unique, but the problem is familiar. Limited housing, intense demand, and very high prices. Many workers who keep the city running live far outside it. Long commutes are normal. Community ties weaken. Oxford shows how extreme housing pressure creates cities that function, but only by pushing ordinary life outward. That's not sustainable long-term. City 9. Cambridge. Like Oxford, Cambridge has strong demand and limited supply. High-skilled jobs exist, but housing costs have exploded. Even well-paid workers struggle. Lower-paid staff are pushed out entirely. Cambridge highlights how economic success without housing planning creates exclusion. A city can be wealthy and still deeply unlivable for most people. City 10. Reading. Reading surprises people. Close to London, strong job market, once seen as a practical choice. Now rents rival larger cities. Competition is fierce. Local wages lag behind costs. Reading shows how pressure spreads outward. When London overflows, nearby cities absorb the demand and the pain. For many residents, Reading no longer offers the balance it once did. Looking at these cities together, a pattern emerges. Different places, different histories, same forces. Rising housing costs, stalled wages, strained services, growing instability. These cities aren't failing because people don't want to live there. They're struggling because too many people want to, and the system can't cope. And the most worrying part is this. None of these cities suddenly became unlivable. They crossed the line quietly. That's what makes this moment so important, because the cities on this list aren't the end of the story. They're the early warning signs. What's happening to them now is what could happen elsewhere next. And unless something changes, the list will only grow. When you step back and look at all 10 cities together, something uncomfortable becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't a collection of separate problems. It's not bad luck. It's not a few cities mismanaging growth. It's one system, producing the same result again and again. Different cities, same outcome. Rising costs push people to the edge. Housing supply lags behind demand, wages fail to keep up, services stretch thin, people leave, and then the city changes. This is the moment most people miss. Because the real damage doesn't show up when prices rise. It shows up when behavior changes, when people stop planning for the future, when they stop settling, when they stop believing a place will work for them long term. That's when a city tips. You can see it in who stays and who leaves. People with options stay. People without them go. Not because they want to, but because they have to. And over time, that creates a kind of sorting. Cities become places where only certain incomes, certain lifestyles, and certain levels of support can survive. That's not diversity. That's exclusion. What makes this moment especially serious is that this pattern is now repeating faster than ever before. In the past, cities had time to adjust. Housing shortages built slowly. Wages had periods to catch up. Infrastructure could expand. That time no longer exists. Demand is moving faster than supply can respond. Costs jump year to year, not decade to decade. And once a city crosses into this phase, the damage compounds. People leaving doesn't relieve pressure. It often makes it worse, because the people who leave are often the ones holding things together. The nurse who can't afford rent near the hospital. The teacher who can't justify staying. The care worker commuting 2 hours each way until they burn out. When those people leave, services weaken. When services weaken, quality of life drops. When quality of life drops, even more people start looking for exits. That's the loop. And it doesn't stop on its own. This is why the phrase unlivable matters. It's not about misery. It's about function. A city stops being livable when normal life becomes unsustainable. When working full-time no longer guarantees stability. When renting means permanent uncertainty. When settling down feels reckless instead of responsible. At that point, people aren't building lives. They're managing risk. And a society built on constant risk is a fragile one. Another hard truth is that this crisis doesn't hit everyone equally. Some people are insulated. If you bought early, rising prices help you. If you have family support, you can lean on it. If you earn well above average, costs hurt less. But for millions of people, none of those protections exist. They're renting. They're early in their careers. They're supporting families. They're essential workers. And when those people start losing faith in cities, the consequences go far beyond housing. Cities rely on trust. Trust that effort leads somewhere. Trust that stability is possible. Trust that the system, while imperfect, works well enough. Once that trust breaks, everything becomes harder. People disengage. They take fewer risks. They stop investing emotionally in places that don't invest in them. And that loss is difficult to measure, but easy to feel. This is where history matters. Because societies that allow cities to become exclusionary don't just face housing problems. They face deeper divides. Between renters and owners. Between insiders and outsiders. Between those who benefit from the system and those trapped by it. And those divides don't stay confined to housing. They spill into politics. They spill into social tension. They spill into how people see their future. This is why dismissing this crisis as just the market is so dangerous. Markets don't exist in isolation. They shape lives. When housing markets reward scarcity, they punish stability. And when stability disappears, everything else becomes harder to hold together. What's most striking about the 10 cities we've looked at is not how different they are, but how similar their stories have become. Different accents, different skylines, same pressures. That tells us something important. This is no longer a local issue, it's a national one. And the cities struggling now are not outliers. They're indicators. They show where the system breaks first. And if nothing changes, the same pressures will reach places that still feel safe today. That's not a prediction. It's a pattern. One that's already played out elsewhere. And once you see that pattern, it's hard to unsee it. Because it explains why so many people feel stuck. Why effort doesn't feel rewarded. Why progress feels delayed. Why leaving feels like the only option. This isn't because people are asking for too much. It's because the basic deal has shifted. Work no longer guarantees security. Cities no longer guarantee opportunity. Housing no longer guarantees stability, and when that deal breaks, trust breaks with it. The most sobering part of all this is that none of these cities suddenly collapsed. They drifted, year by year, policy by policy, decision by decision, and because the decline was slow, it was easy to ignore. Until suddenly, it wasn't. Until people started asking why they were paying so much for so little in return. Until the question changed from how do I get ahead to how do I get out. That's the moment cities should fear most. Because when enough people ask that question, the character of a place changes permanently. Cities don't recover easily from that. They can rebuild buildings. They can attract investment, but rebuilding trust is much harder. And that's where the UK now finds itself. At a point where the warning signs are clear, but the response remains uncertain. The 10 cities we've talked about are not failures. They're symptoms. They show what happens when housing stops being treated as the foundation of everyday life and becomes something else, something scarce, something protected, something increasingly out of reach. And the cost of that shift isn't just financial. It's social, it's emotional, it's generational. It shapes who gets to stay, who gets to leave, and who never gets a chance to belong at all. That's why this moment matters. Because cities are not just places where people live. They are where futures are built. And right now, in too many parts of the UK, that future is narrowing instead of opening. The question is not whether this trend will continue. The question is whether it will be acknowledged before it spreads further. Because once cities cross the line from difficult to unlivable, going back is never easy. And the UK is closer to that line than many people want to admit. By this point, one thing should be clear. What's happening in these UK cities isn't a mystery. And it isn't a sudden shock. It's the result of pressures building quietly over years, now reaching a point where they can't be ignored anymore. Housing costs rose faster than wages. Supply fell behind demand. Services stretched thinner every year. And instead of being corrected early, those problems were allowed to stack. The result is what we're seeing now. Cities that still look busy and successful on the surface, but feel harder and more fragile once you live inside them. This is why the word unlivable matters so much. Not because life stops completely, but because the basics stop making sense. When a full-time job no longer covers rent and bills, when moving constantly feels normal, when staying feels risky, and leaving feels inevitable. That's when something fundamental has broken. And what makes this moment different from the past is how widespread the pressure has become. It's no longer contained in one city or one region. It's no longer just a London story. It's showing up in places people once thought were safe. That's the real warning here. Because when affordability collapses in cities that used to offer balance, the system has run out of room to shift the problem elsewhere. There's nowhere left to push the pressure. Another thing that matters is who is being affected. This crisis doesn't hit abstract groups. It hits real people. People working ordinary jobs, people raising families, people starting out, people keeping cities running. When those people can't stay, cities don't just lose residents, they lose stability. They lose teachers who would have stayed long-term. They lose nurses who would have built careers. They lose workers who would have put down roots. And once that happens, quality of life declines for everyone, even those who can still afford to stay. This is why the idea that rising prices means success is so misleading. A city isn't successful if it only works for a shrinking group of people. A city isn't healthy if normal life requires constant sacrifice. And a country isn't stable if its cities quietly push out the people they depend on. Another uncomfortable truth is that none of this will fix itself. Markets don't naturally restore balance when housing is treated as an investment first and a place to live second. Without enough homes, prices won't fall in a meaningful way. Without better wages, affordability won't return. Without stronger local services, pressure won't ease. Small changes around the edges won't be enough. And that's not pessimism, it's realism. Understanding the problem clearly is the first step toward any real solution. Ignoring it only allows it to spread. One of the most dangerous ideas right now is that this crisis is temporary, that if people just wait long enough, things will go back to how they were. History doesn't support that. Once housing costs reset upward and cities reorganize around higher prices, they rarely move backwards on their own. The new normal becomes locked in. And that's why this conversation matters now, not later. Because the cities struggling today are showing what happens first, not what happens last. They are the early warnings. What they're experiencing now is what other places may face in the coming years if nothing changes. That doesn't mean every city is doomed. It doesn't mean decline is inevitable. But it does mean that pretending everything is fine is no longer an option. At the very least, people deserve honesty about what's happening and why. They deserve to know that struggling doesn't mean they failed. That feeling stuck isn't a personal flaw. That the pressure they feel is real, shared, and structural. Because once people understand that, the conversation changes. It stops being about blame and starts being about reality. And reality is this: a country cannot function well if ordinary life becomes unsustainable in its cities. Cities are not just economic engines. They are places where people build futures. If those futures feel smaller, more fragile, and more uncertain each year, something is deeply wrong. The 10 cities we've looked at are not warnings to be ignored. They are messages. Messages about what happens when housing, wages, and services drift out of balance for too long. Messages about the cost of delay, and messages about the kind of choices the UK will have to face sooner rather than later. Because the question is no longer whether this crisis exists. The question is how far it's allowed to go before it's taken seriously, and whether the cities people love today will still feel livable tomorrow. If you want to understand what comes next for Britain's cities, subscribe.